Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this event organized by the Austrian Institute for International Affairs, based in Vienna. This is a online Zoom meeting where we're going to discuss and analyze election results in Turkey. As most of you know, these elections have raised huge international attention. The Economist even called these elections as the most important elections of the year. And on 14th of May, most of us were surprised by the election results. Polls were suggesting a totally different outcome, a huge landslide win of the opposition. Instead, President Erdogan gained 49.5% of the votes, so he almost achieved the 50% plus one vote threshold, whereas the opposition candidate Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu ended at around 45%, a bit even lower than 45%. A big surprise was the third presidential candidate, Sinan Oğan, a secular nationalist who gained more than 5% of the votes. Until now, he was more or less a no-name, and now he seems to be the kingmaker. To make a long story short, we are going into a second round of the presidential elections. This is something new to Turkey, unexperienced, and it seems that President Erdogan is certainly in a better starting position, also because parliamentary elections led to an overall majority of the pro-government bloc, the People's Alliance led by the AKP and the ultra-nationalist MHP. And instead of a huge change, democratic change that was expected, we have one of the most conservative nationalist parliaments in Turkish history. We are going to discuss what this means, what to expect, why this has happened, and what does it mean for the second round, and what are the implications for Turkey and much beyond, with my esteemed colleagues, friends, and experts. I'll start with Senem Aydın Düzgit. She is a professor at Sabancı University at the Department of International Relations, and then a senior expert at the Istanbul Policy Center. Her research is focusing on European foreign policy, Turkish foreign policy, discourse studies, and politics of identity. And she has many publications dealing with EU-Turkey relations. One of the most recent ones is Gendering Public Diplomacy, Turkey and Europe in the 1930s. So she has also a historical IR perspective. Berk Esen, sorry, Senem, if you could say hi. It's participants then after the recording also see you.
Okay, hello. Hi, everyone.
Hello,
thank you
welcome.
very much, Cengiz, for the welcome.
Thank you for joining. Berk Esen is assistant professor at political science in the Department of Political Science at Sabancı University. He has a PhD in government from Cornell University, and his research interests are political economy, party politics, authoritarian regimes in Latin America and the Middle East. And one of his most recent publications is Post-Kemalism. It's published in Turkish and has gained a lot of attention in Turkish policy science circles. He has other publications such as Party Change and Cleavage Shifting in the Global South, the case of Ecevit's CHP in Turkey. Sebnem Gümüşcü, hi, sorry, Berk, if you could also say hi.
Hi, everyone.
Welcome back. And Sebnem Gümüşcü is an associate professor of political science at Middlebury College in the United States. Before that, she was also part of Sabancı University. And her research interests are political Islam, dominant parties, democratization, and democratic backsliding. And her most recent publication is a very timely book, Democracy or Authoritarianism, Islamist Governments in Turkey, Egypt, and in Tunisia, published with Cambridge University Press. Berk and Sebnem have also jointly published a often quoted article, I have to say, unfortunately, often quoted because Turkey, they term Turkey as a competitive authoritarian regime. And unfortunately, we do now see the effects of a competitive authoritarian regime in the context of these elections. Let me start with Sebnem. How do you explain Erdogan's victory? Why does it come as a surprise? After all, we call Turkey a competitive authoritarian regime. And just before you start, because I forgot to say, if our participants have any questions, please write them into the chat. And at the end of our discussion, I'll also try to open the floor and include you, if possible, into the discussion. Certainly, I will address your questions. Sorry, Sebnem, back to you. Why are we surprised?
Thank you.
How do you explain? Yeah.
Thank you for that question, and thank you for organizing this panel. Well, I think it's surprising that we're surprised for a number of reasons. It isn't a competitive authoritarian regime. We've been talking about that for a while, but I think we were focused on the authoritarian aspects for quite a bit, and we kind of overlooked the competitive part of Erdogan's regime. I think that made us a bit kind of, shocked looking at the results on Sunday's election. So we were expecting a lot about his authoritarian reactions, whether or not he's going to rig the election, whether or not he's going to accept a defeat. So we were really kind of, occupied by that part of the regime, and we missed the competitive part quite a bit in our analysis, in our understanding of the expectations of the results. So then the question is, what really makes the regime so competitive, and what makes Erdogan such an appealing presidential candidate still, despite the fact that there's a huge economic crisis going on in the country, high levels of inflation, people are getting poorer by the day, especially lower income families and middle income families having a very hard time paying their utilities, paying their rents, sending their kids to schools. So there's a lot of hardship, economic hardship, especially among Erdogan supporters. So this is puzzling, and people were expecting that this was it for Erdogan. He could not consolidate his support base any longer, given the fact that economic hardships are really kind of, making it harder for these people to survive on a daily basis. So there was a lot of expectation that many of these people will just stop supporting him. Maybe they will not turn out to vote. Maybe they will vote for the opposition candidate. That was the expectation, but we clearly saw on Sunday that that was not the case at all. I was watching the polls on Sunday, 6 a.m. in the morning until 7:30, 8 at night. It was really interesting to see how high turnout was. And I was in a AKP stronghold. Those of you who know Istanbul, Ümraniye is one of the consistent supporters of Erdogan for 25, 30 years now. So the people, they had a lot of excitement, and they were really insistent on casting their votes. They waited in lines for hours because the ballots were huge, and it took several minutes for a single voter to cast their ballots. So it was really kind of a very strong bill, and I was a bit surprised to see that, because I thought, frankly, and this is myself, maybe reflection on okay, where did I underestimated Erdogan's power? This was it. So I was not really expecting him to mobilize. Pretty much everyone who can vote for him showed up to vote. And in my own ballot box, the turnout was at 94%. So
the turnout was 94.
Turnout, yeah. In my ballot box, it was.
And what were the votes for Erdogan?
Yes, yeah. So 198 for Erdogan and 137 for Kılıçdaroğlu. So that's not a bad.
This is huge. Yeah.
Yeah.
Where were you, Sebnem? I'm just out of curiosity.
Ümraniye. I was in Ümraniye.
Okay, sorry. Yeah. Okay.
So that is really kind of what we see usually in these parts of the country, in Istanbul. So I've been watching polls in Ümraniye for 9 years now. This is the highest turnout I have seen in 8.
And also the highest vote for an opposition candidate, you would say?
No. The 2015. 2015 June elections, I could see the election results from my own, ballot box. You can understand if you know what that part of the country, like, what their preferences are typically, traditionally, you can see if they are kind of, defecting their, from their usual choices. So the most surprising outcome I had in terms of in favor of the opposition was in June 2015. And when I looked at my own ballot box results, I was like, okay, this is going to be a hard day for AKP. That was clearly visible at the ballot box level. So
Sebnem, can I just add a question to it? Because yesterday, mainly on Twitter, many allegations regarding election fraud appeared, and there were many discussions going on. I think we were all somehow also reacting to that. What is about this? What do you think about these allegations? Was there election fraud? And if so, did they somehow affect the outcome?
I know this is a very unpopular view, but I'm going to say it regardless. I don't see any systematic evidence of fraud in this election. And I've been doing this for a while, like now almost a decade now. And Turkish elections are really very clean most of the time. I'm not saying always, but most of the time, because the system itself is structured in such a way that there are so many different ways you can actually kind of, check for errors, fix them rather easily. And there's so many eyes on the ballot, boxes and counting process that it's very, very hard to have a very systematic wide-scale fraud in Turkey. I don't think this election was an exception in that sense. And I mean, Erdogan has a huge machine, electoral machine. The very early hours of the day, 6:30 a.m. in the morning, I've seen 45, 50 people from the AKP party organization arriving in our school, and we were all scattered as volunteers, waiting to watch the polls, and they came in with the, in droves, and like, that was a very huge, message that we're here and we're gonna take care of this process. Despite that presence, strong presence that Erdogan supporters actually had on Sunday, I have not seen any kind of irregularities in my own school, or I have not heard, and we were in contact with so many different people in Istanbul at least, and I have not heard any stories from Fatih, other schools in Ümraniye, all these strongholds of AKP. We know that they have been kind of going after every single vote. They pushed, for example, in especially opposition strongholds, they asked for recounts multiple times. So they are very much adamant in protecting their own votes for sure. But they have been doing that for several years now, for 20 years. Anyway, so turnout, I think, is a very, very important part of that story. And I was a bit surprised that AKPs or Erdogan supporters, not AKP because they are in decline, Erdogan supporters showed up, strongly showed up, and they were like, okay, we are going to win this for sure. I think one of the reasons why we were mistaken or misled were the polls, pre-election polls. And it seems to be that in those polls, at least, if they were conducted, in an accurate fashion and following some methodological, rules, I think some Erdogan supporters concealed their preferences or did not say.
Thank you, Sebnem, for the time being. I'll come back. Senem, it's, I think what was different in this in the lead up to the elections was that Erdogan and the pro-government camp somehow lost the dominance in the discourse, in the public discourse. At least that was my observation. It was the opposition setting the themes and setting the topics. And it was very much about economy and the mismanagement of the earthquake catastrophe. But also democracy and rule of law. And now it seems like it's been identity politics, polarization around identity politics that has been more important. Can we see, what's your analysis? Because it's always been the assumption that it's the economy stupid that actually determines elections. But Turkey seems to prove different. And maybe this is also telling for other examples.
Yeah. I mean, I think there are a number of factors there at work. first of all, the economic crisis or the state that Turkey is in economically is not felt the same across the entire country. I think there is a major difference as to how you experience the housing crisis in major cities like Istanbul, for instance, and whether you're experiencing such a crisis, you know, somewhere in the outskirts of Anatolia is another matter, which probably you're not. And on top of that, political patronage networks are extremely strong at the local level. You know, also in the big cities, but even more so, I would say, in those places in Anatolia, Black Sea, etc., that do seem to have an effect. So first of all, we need to question the extent to which the whole population is experiencing the crisis at the same level of intensity. And I think that's an important question. I mean, when, for instance, Erdogan increases, you know, he has increased, you know, the retirement wages or, you know, what have you, is gone into massive splurge and public spending before the elections, which of course is a big question, is what's going to happen afterwards with all that splurge, and we're going to have to pay for it. But that's another question. That's a question for the post-election period, and I think that's his concern. But that seems to have made a difference in the eyes of some of his voters who are from lower classes or lower middle classes or whatever, and he seems to be quite happy to see that he's actually delivering. Another question, and that another issue, and that relates more directly to your question, Cengiz, is the notion of loyalty. Now, when we think about identity, I don't think we should just think of it in terms of, you know, Muslim identity, ethnic identity, and this and that, as we conventionally have written about and spoken so much about in the past. But there is also an element of loyalty here that we have to consider. Now, what do I mean by that? Just to simplify that, when you ask an AKP supporter, he or she might very well say, and we hear these arguments that, yes, you know, we are in dire straits. Yes, we are aware that there is inflation and the economy isn't doing so well. But Erdogan has delivered for us in the past, right? He's made our access to the hospitals easier. He's done this, he's done that. And we are loyal, and we're not going to abandon him at a time of distress. I think this rhetoric is strong, and I think that was also a rhetoric that was pressed by the government as well, right? Do not abandon him. This is a difficult time. He has been there for you. He's elevated your status in Turkish society, your access to public services, the visibility of your religion, your identity, everywhere, right? And I think that loyalty, you know, perhaps, you know, more restricted to the core of AKP base, but that still resonates. So that is why, for instance, you might see less votes for the AKP in parliament, but more for Erdogan, right? Because there is this Erdogan figure, and loyalty is not necessarily to the party, but in my opinion, more so to the leader. Of course, Sebnem and Berk work on these issues much more than I do. So please do correct me that if you think I'm wrong, because I might be, because I am an IR scholar, obviously. So, but this is at least my impression of what's happening. Another issue about the identity dimension is, of course, this whole question about the Kurds, which we need to talk about as well, because I think sometimes we feel like, you know, I mean, obviously, this is not a problem unique to Turkey. You have it in the US, in other places, where you live in your echo chamber and in your little bubble, in social media, whatever, that might give you the impression that, you know, the opposition rhetoric holds. Well, maybe it doesn't, because the other side, yes, they are also campaigning, and one of the central points of their campaign was that the opposition was working in tandem with the PKK. Now, for a Democrat, liberal, or more objective observer, that might seem completely absurd, but that's not how it's perceived in the eyes of some of the electorate, and it's something that actually unites them, right? There were deep fake videos that were shown to people from door to door, you know, in the Aegean and Anatolia, everywhere. And of course, you know, there are no post-election research as such. We don't know how effective they've been. But I think this whole surge of nationalist votes as well goes to show that they might have had some effect.
That was my add-on question, actually. How do you explain the high votes for the MHP, a party that has been in tight coalition with Erdogan for a long time, and where you can almost claim that the leader is senile? And so it's very surprising that they got more than 10% of the votes in parliamentary elections. How do you explain that?
I think the MHP vote always puzzles us, right, after every election, because this is a party which doesn't even bother coming out with an election manifesto We don't know where they stand about key issues that face society, domestic or foreign policy wise, but they still tend to get 10% of the votes or something similar around that anyway. And that never shows in the polls, by the way, right? That's also another kind of absurd issue. But I think part of it has to do with the fact that, you know, this is something that we've experienced, that we witnessed in the elections before, is that people who are disillusioned with AKP, they remain in the camp. They show their disillusionment not by voting for the opposition, but by voting for other parties within that, you know, governing right-wing coalition, whether, you know, that's the MHP or the New Welfare Party or whatever the others. And MHP here is, of course, a major player because it's also an historically established party. I think that's one of the reasons why the MHP leader wanted to enter into elections with their logo. As, I mean, you know, most people were perplexed that why should they do that? They're going to lose seats. No, they didn't. Because most people, when they see that logo, you know, it resonates and they go and vote for it, right? So they have a loyal supporter base as well, because of all kinds of reasons. So, you know, it might, you know, again, but this also boils to identity. It also boils to the fact that, you know, the electorate wants to punish the AKP, but they don't want to be rewarding or seem like they're rewarding the opposition for it, because the opposition is still far cry from them, especially if they're a nationalist electorate. So they go and switch the MHP. And of course, I mean, I do agree with Sebnem that I don't think that electoral fraud had happened to the extent that it would change the general picture that we have. But I think I always have a hunch that since 2015, MHP votes in certain places, especially in the East and Southeast, where, you know, voter suppression is more prevalent, where, you know, we don't know who's voting for whom, and there's very little scrutiny by the opposition parties, and those who can scrutinize on the part of HDP are mostly jailed anyway. So I feel that there is some of that going on as well, that kinds of leads to more of an increase in MHP vote in the Southeast than perhaps it is. Again, I don't have any data for this. People have to study this, scholars, whatever, but I have that impression. But I mean, that would make what difference? I mean, 1%, 2%, whatever. That still doesn't change the picture, but there is that element as well that I feel like we do need to mention.
Thank you so much. Berk, it seems like polarization has again worked well, and as in the mobilization of the pro-government electorate, whereas the opposition actually tried to send out a different message. It was conciliatory and uniting, you know, and the message of love, and, you know, we are all welcome. Was this a wrong strategy, would you say, in hindsight? It seems like for the second round, that's at least what I read, the opposition will change its strategy and will also become kind of more confrontative. How do you assess, because I know you know well the opposition and have written a lot on the CHP, how do you assess the strategy of the opposition, and where do you see weaknesses?
Well, it wasn't necessarily a wrong strategy, but I think it was the wrong candidate coming up with this strategy. And so at the end of the day, Erdogan could not really make it to the 50% mark. Let's not lose track of the fact that he has underperformed compared to the 2014 and 2018 elections, and that maybe a more energetic campaigner, a different candidate would maybe slight sort of differences in terms of strategy could have actually won in this election, either in the first round or in the second round. So I don't want to completely, you know, bombast the opposition strategy or the opposition alliance, because at the end of the day, the opposition candidate got 45% of the vote share, which still is a respectable showing in a, again, let's not forget, in a competitive authoritarian regime where you have an uneven playing field tilted towards the incumbent, and the elections are neither free nor fair. We haven't necessarily mentioned it, but I think this is not going to be news to the participants of this panel, as well as probably most people in the audience, that the media is under severe restriction and government censorship. The state bureaucracy is almost completely dominated by the incumbent's party, and public resources are used in a very partisan manner to let the incumbent win the election. So it's you know, it's already an uphill battle. Now, you know, both my colleagues have, I think, did an excellent summary of telling us the incumbent side of the story. So I'm not necessarily going to focus on that, but let me just add that I think because of everything that has been said so far, Erdogan really managed to mobilize his base, right? So Turkish society is extremely polarized, and it seems that opposition voters went to the polls, to ballot boxes in high numbers, but so did the pro-government voters, right? Partly because there was, for the first time, a risk of losing for AKP and Erdogan, and like Senem mentioned, that loyalty. I think Erdogan engaged, pushed for this populist agenda of redistribution, early retirement, increased salaries for the pensioners, for the minimum wages, raises for the civil servants, new hiring spree for the state bureaucracy, the whole notion of a strong Turkish state and a defense industry, the emotional bond between Erdogan and his voters, but coming now to the opposition, an anti-Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu message, right? Whether you in the opposition camp, whether you like him or not, at the end of the day, I think not many people would object to this claim that Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu is basically a 74-year-old politician. He's not necessarily seen as a very inspiring, energetic campaigner. And he's an old name. I mean, he's been around as the leader of CHP since 2010, already being exposed to the negative campaigning of the government machine for 13 years. And simply, I think many voters had already made up their minds on Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. So regardless of what the campaign could have done or already did, I think it was difficult to really change people's viewpoints on Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, and that no matter what or which opinion poll you look at, the anti-Erdogan vote seems to be the majority, but so is the anti-Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu vote. And I think that's one reason why, in such a polarized context, you could still have a spoiler candidate get 5% of the vote share without any kind of national campaign, without any kind of a strong national organization. So I think with the choice of Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, this was a impaired, defective campaign from the start. And already, I think the whole candidate nomination process was a bit bruising, that Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu very skillfully ended up sidelining what were clearly two more popular alternatives. The current Istanbul mayor, Ekrem İmamoğlu, who I think would have been a much better choice, and the current Ankara mayor, Mansur Yavaş. And I think in order to do that, in order to make sure that he would rise as the joint candidate of the opposition alliance, he ended up empowering these four right-wing minor political parties, which did not have a very strong national organization and which seems to have not really a strong electorate or electoral base, and basically run against the party.
Is that, sorry, Berk, to interrupt, is that the reason why the CHP underperformed also in the parliamentary elections? Because there was not a significant rise in the share of votes.
I think that was part of the reason. I think, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu's message is not really credible because he talks about change, but the people around him within the party leadership has not changed over the past 6 or 7 years. How can I trust a politician who basically tells that he's going to democratize the country and change everything when he is not necessarily running the main opposition party in a democratic manner, and he has not necessarily appointed competent officials around him? So I think, I don't want to belabor the point, but at the end of the day, with a series of election defeats under his belt, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu's message was simply not credible, and that he basically ran a campaign that was based on carefully choreographed messages disseminated through the social media. And this is simply not enough in a competitive authoritarian context. With my colleague Sebnem, we had a discussion 10 days ago, and this is exactly a point that I was making her during our phone conversations. There was really no campaign on the ground, right? Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu kept on sharing these social media messages and videos from his kitchen, which probably reached out to most of the opposition voters. It energized some opposition voters, but it did not really bring in a lot of swing voters. And considering the fact that he has made, I think throughout the course of a 6-week campaign, probably close to 25 or maybe 30 videos, he undermined his own message. That if you were to ask me, what Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu promised to the voters, I wouldn't be able to give you a comprehensive answer because he promised everything. And I will not even be able to summarize it. So there was such a confusion when it came to the message and the agenda that Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu pushed forward. There was also inconsistency in the message that the opposition alliance was giving to the electorate, because this was a 6-party opposition alliance. But interestingly, there were really 2 parties with a national organization. The main opposition, CHP, center-left, and İYİ Party, which is moderate Turkish nationalist party. Other than that, these other 4 minor right-wing parties did not really bring in any votes, but they kept on making statements that contradicted some of the initial points raised by either Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu or the İYİ Party leader, Meral Akşener. So at the end of the day, for voters, you simply had a very inconsistent, very diverse opposition package that did not really give you huge confidence of change, because you have Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, but also did not give you much confidence about strong governance, strong, stable rule. And at a time when you have a massive economic crisis, a devastating earthquake, a mess, and the country is surrounded by these enemies, kind of network, rhetoric, I think a lot of voters, a lot of swing voters and pro-government voters wanted stability and wanted strong rule that Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu could not really give. So I think he gave a lot of positive messages. There was nothing wrong in that. He used a very unifying discourse, which was great. And, to his credit, partly, at least, he managed to really bring together a very diverse alliance, taking in votes from Kurds in the southeastern provinces, Turkish secularists, center-lefts, socialists, and even some nationalists. But I think the same message, the same campaign, if it were to be conducted by a different candidate, particularly Ekrem İmamoğlu, who I think would have easily brought together that large coalition, but would have brought a new face and dynamism and a much better physical campaign on the ground, the results would have been slightly different. Now, I don't know if it would have been enough.
Would have been enough.
Yeah, we had this discussion earlier with Senem yesterday that I'm also not sure if that would have been sufficient for 50%, but I think he would have gotten more votes than Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. Yeah. And a final point, this goes back to your question, but from a more thematic point of view, in a competitive authoritarian regime where you basically have an uneven playing field, but still electoral competition is meaningful, I think party organizations are extremely important. At the end of the day, the opposition candidates have limited access to national media. And even if they try to use social media, in our social media age, that message really goes to the echo chambers and can easily be manipulated by the other side. I think what you need is door-to-door canvassing, candidates who speak to swing voters, not only with their discourse, but also with their personality, with their political careers. Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu simply didn't, and I don't want to turn this into a personal point. But at the end of the day, when you are the main opposition leader for the last 13 years, with no single electoral success, maybe with the exception of 2019 local elections, it's difficult for you to give that message credibly. And he brought a lot of baggage, right? In order to defeat a popular incumbent at such a regime, you need people without a baggage. You need fresh faces who can actually speak to diverse audiences through their personal biography, through their personal background, and basically have strong party organizations that can back up that campaign. Unfortunately, the opposition fell short, not tremendously short. I mean, like I said, 45% is actually a respectable showing, and had the Kılıçdaroğlu campaign not increased expectations excessively and done slightly better, let's say Erdogan were to get 48% as opposed to 49.5, and Kılıçdaroğlu got, say, 47, this would have still been a very competitive election.
And I guess it would have been an important element also for the second round in terms of mobilization, I guess, because as a conclusion from this first round, I feel like it's less than being surprised that Erdogan won, we should be surprised that actually the opposition was this successful, despite probably a wrong candidate, weak campaigning, and so on and so forth. Let's go to the second round of our analysis here, and I would kindly ask you to keep this second round, the answers short, because it's about the second round. What do we expect? I'd like to start with you, Sebnem, again. Do you think that in this second round, in these 2 weeks leading to the elections on the 28th, nationalist conservative themes will be dominating and the security discourse? What's your feel for what's going to dominate this second electoral or campaigning?
Well, we have no idea still, because the second round campaign has not started. That is I think is a problem, because we now have 10 days left, and it's a very short amount of time. My expectation is that the opposition will seek some kind of balance between Kurdish support and Turkish nationalists that are secular in orientation but quite undecided, and they're looking for an option. So they're torn between Erdogan and Kılıçdaroğlu. So Kılıçdaroğlu's task is to convince those undecided Turkish nationalists without losing the Kurdish support. Everyone knows about this. This is the dilemma that he's facing. I'm not sure how he's going to do that, because that's a very hard task. And I also expect maybe he will turn towards a little kind of towards right and have a more nationalist discourse. I also expect him to put more emphasis on the economic problems and what's to come after the elections are over in the second round, in the runoff, if Erdogan wins. So I think that's going to be a kind of, an element of fear injected into the opposition campaign, something that the opposition campaign avoided thus far. They were trying to keep a positive message, more hopeful message, trying to kind of create a dream for a bright future for Turkey. So that was the message all along. And I think that was a very constructive and hopeful message that brought a lot of excitement to the opposition, camp. So I feel like I expect that there will be a little kind of more fear elements introduced into that discourse, and rightfully so, because the future of the Turkish economy, as Senem alluded to, is not good, right? So given the expansionist fiscal policies and the promises that Erdogan made in a very populist fashion over the last couple of weeks, so that is very worrisome. And we know that the international financial institutions do not trust Erdogan government with orthodox policies. His interest rate policy puzzles everyone. So there's a lot of kind of problems there. I expect the opposition to switch its campaign towards okay, this is what's going to happen if Erdogan wins in the second round. And then there are also other concerns as to women's rights, because this is the most conservative nationalist and also Islamist parliament we have ever seen, with the very, very far right Hüdapar even getting seats thanks to Erdogan's cooperation with them, and as also the new welfare party. So this is a very Islamist government as well. With that extensive support from the parliament, there's a lot to fear, and there's a significant message that the opposition can convey to the women, conservative women in particular, for two issues: economic crisis and inflation that will hit hard women in particular, and also their rights are very much threatened. Even if they're conservative, they are have a lot to lose.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for keeping it short, because I want to then go in the third round to implications in the long term for Turkey. Berk, do you think Kılıçdaroğlu can still make it in the second round? Does he still have chances? What would you say?
I think it's difficult for a number of reasons. First, it seems that he was shocked and dismayed by the results, and for the last 3 days he hasn't really made a public appearance other than sharing again social media, very carefully crafted messages on the social media, including, by the way, 30 minutes ago. So just as we were about to start the panel, he released another video, and it seems very similar to, along the same lines as Sebnem's point. Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu is now inciting a very nationalist message, talking about 10 million refugees living in Turkey, that he's going to kick them out, and that he's going to basically prosecute the people who opened up the Ergenekon and Balyoz trials. The irony is that that message is in direct contradiction with the message shared by Gelecek Partisi and Deva Party, these two splinter parties. So my sense is that they will be very silent during the campaign, if not openly contradict Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. And I think this would be the beginning of the Deva and Gelecek Partisi MPs moving away from the opposition alliance. And thanks to Kılıçdaroğlu's big strategy of bringing everyone under the tent of CHP, these minor parties that don't even have 1% are now represented in the Turkish parliament with nearly 40 seats. So in addition to what Sebnem mentioned, 330 seats out of 600 being occupied by very right-wing, very Islamist, very nationalist MPs. Thanks to Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, the CHP joint list also is, out of 165 seats, nearly 40 are that. So would that be enough? Given the polarization in the country, probably many opposition voters will go out to vote, but I just don't see how the opposition candidate can mobilize the fringe opposition elements in the alliance so that the turnout rate would go down among opposition voters. Now, let's just hope that the same thing would happen to the ruling coalition, because, going back to what we discussed in the first round, pro-government voters went to the ballot boxes en masse in order to defend Erdogan. But now that Erdogan came so close to victory, let's just hope that at least their enthusiasm would go down too, and that we're going to have a lower level of participation. My sense is that at the end of the day, it's not going to be enough. But of course, there is a optimistic and pessimistic and a very pessimistic scenario. The optimistic scenario, I would give this 5% probability that somehow the anti-incumbent vote turns out and votes for Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu and he barely wins. It's very difficult. It's a very small probability. I think the more realistic scenario will be that opposition voters will be mobilized, government voters will be mobilized, and we're going to end up with like 47 to 53%. And after a few weeks of licking our wounds, we're going to say, well, under these difficult circumstances, finally, we managed to push the election to a second round and got 47%. Next time, we're going to do better. Because, of course, there is a local election coming up in March 2024. And my pessimistic scenario, actually going to the more pessimistic scenario, is that Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu's strategy so far has been so devastating in terms of putting all eggs into one basket that now, not only that all these opposition parties are defeated, but also Mansur Yavaş and Ekrem İmamoğlu themselves are defeated because they run under this ticket formula together with Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, and that because of these internal tensions, they may have difficulty winning the mayoral races in March 2024. And in the event of a Kılıçdaroğlu loss, if he refuses to step down from CHP leadership, it's going to be a very, very, very difficult scenario for the Turkish opposition. He needs to go.
Thank you, Berk. Senem, is Erdogan weakened? Is he strengthened? I mean, after all, it's the first election where he personally did not win in the very first round in the first place. So is he weakened? And what does that, or is he strengthened? And what to expect? Like, how is he going to react? Do we need to fear further autocratization in Turkey?
Thank you, Cengiz. Can I just add perhaps two things also to what Berk and Sebnem also said? I generally agree with them. Just that, Berk, I have a feeling that perhaps it might even be better if other little parties didn't speak at all, to be honest with you. because we have seen that they have had absolutely no contribution in terms of votes, and their presence perhaps even worked to to the government's advantage, in the sense that they turned some voters away to Sinan Oğan, or perhaps they didn't feel motivated to vote. I don't know. I mean, we don't know the numbers, but my sense is that, because if you look at the overall CHP vote, it's really, I mean, it's terrible, right? 25%, despite everything going on. I mean, it just makes me think, wouldn't it be much better if all these parties at least went in with their logos, and at least we would have seen that they got like 0.1% of the vote, or 0.5 or whatever. Anyhow, so I had to say that. I just had to say that. Now, secondly, I do agree with Sebnem that I haven't seen the video yet, so I'll check it out after the Zoom back. But I have a sense that he will turn towards nationalism, yes, but not through a discourse on the Kurds, but through the discourse on migrants. So migrants will be the wrath of his nationalist tone. And of course, that is done to capture the İnce and Oğan, or the far right voter who's just kind of floating out there somewhere. I think he will do that, and maybe he needs to do that also to win, right? I mean, I'm not a anti-migrant. I'm not personally in fond of, or politically in fond of, an anti-migrant discourse, but given his priority to win, maybe he will, and maybe he should, looking at it purely from an electoral winning perspective. Now, so there's my 2 points. Okay, now about Cengiz's question about whether Erdogan has won. Well, I mean,
do you see him weakened, or like is he somehow weakened?
Cengiz, I do see him weakening, to be honest, because he's owing more and more to his nationalist partner to remain in power. So he's becoming more indebted, in other words, right? If it wasn't for MHP and the General Nationalist Coalition, that it's very doubtful whether he would have won, right? So, I mean, and they're also very well settled in the bureaucracy, in the institutions, in the police administration, etc. So he's actually, I mean, he has been sharing the power with them, but after these election results, I feel like that asymmetry is becoming a bit more symmetrical, right? For that is in favor of MHP and the nationalists. My hunch is that, well, this could go both ways, right? So if after the second election also Erdogan wins, and then if Erdogan cannot stop an even further autocratic takeover by the extreme nationalist forces, the country could be facing much darker days in terms of civil liberties and the future of democracy. That is my fear. I mean, even with Erdogan, of course, that's my fear. But the fact that he's becoming more and more indebted to the far-right nationalists, I would say, makes this a more likely and also a very pessimistic scenario. So yes, he's of course still strong, but he couldn't make it in the first round, right? He barely made it, despite all the propaganda power. I mean, I think we should underline that as well, right? I mean, I'm not sure if we have emphasized this sufficiently, but we should. I mean, Berk has mentioned it, but I mean, they have huge financial power, organizational power, propaganda power. More than half of the population in Turkey don't watch social media. They look at news, they look at national TV, and 24/7 they're listening to government propaganda. So that is an effect. I don't think we can completely, assume that this has no relevance or no effect. I think it does. Okay, and we have witnessing a party, thanks to the alliance with the MHP, which has positioned itself as the embodiment of the state. And I think that has a very different meaning for, the society at large, because they're not just seeing a political party anymore, they see the state. I think we can kind of, we should, I think, talk about, let's say, responses of the earthquake, people in the earthquake zones, etc., also in the context of that this is the state, okay? So if you go against it, you're going against the state. And there is certain kind of a sacred element of that for some parts of the population, not all, obviously, but some, okay? And that's what they're playing into. And I think that's also an important part of the story. But of course, that the more this is happening, as I said, I think, again, I don't know, this is my hunch, that the more sort of that he's becoming kind of entrenched in this in this nationalist alliance with the MHP and its sort of offshoots everywhere. And his party is shrinking, I think, as a result of that, if you look at the parliamentary votes, right? And I suspect that this would continue in the coming years. So I'm not sure if there will come a day if he'll regret this. But I think that might be a direction that we're going to. But I don't know. We'll have to. I mean, there are so many unknowns. We'll have to see the scale of the economic crisis. We will have to see whether the government will be able to weather that storm, and how they will do so. If they can weather that storm somehow, I don't know, right? I'm not an economist, but with Qatari money, Russians, I don't know where. It's hard to see anything sufficient coming from that direction because the scale of the economic crisis is expected to be big. At least that's what the economists are saying, right? But if he can somehow manage to weather that, now I think they might go in a full autocratization mode. That is my major fear for the country.
Oh, thank you. Well,
I'm sorry if I'm being too pessimistic.
No. Thank you so much because you've given me, you've built the bridge to the next topic. How would a potential third term as president of Erdogan look like after 25 years in power? How would Turkey look like? And I would like to ask you, Sebnem, the question: many people in Turkey and beyond fear that these elections were the last, where this was the last chance. Probably, whether it's right or wrong, I don't know, but there's a psychological aspect to it. Do you fear that in a potential third presidential term, Tayyip Erdogan might calibrate the whole system of Turkey and turn it into something different from now, or even further consolidate the presidential system, that a shift back is hardly possible and guarantees continuous success of this right-wing conservative Islamic bloc?
I'm a bit more optimistic in that sense because, I mean, when you look at Erdogan's entire political trajectory, you see that there's a lot of emphasis on elections. So he is really, really fixated with elections and electoral competition. And he has some kind of, he receives that validation from winning elections. Yes, this was kind of a defeat for him, but given the circumstances, he also got, a good outcome. So, and it's likely that he's going to win the runoff. So I'm thinking, in my understanding of his worldview, what we know about his, political experience thus far, I don't think he will end running in elections or change anything about what we already have. Competitive authoritarian regime actually serves his purposes quite well. It has two main pillars. It's authoritarian, but also competitive at the same time, which gives him a great degree of legitimacy in the eyes of his people because he has so much popular support. And as long as that popular support is there, he can secure it. There's no reason for him to change the rules of the game. He tweaks it and turns it into an authoritarian kind of structure with that uneven playing field. But I really don't see a likely scenario where he lets go of the competitive element altogether and turns this into a fully autocratic regime. Because of his desire to keep that element of legitimacy intact. And given the fact that his party is getting increasingly weaker, this is becoming increasingly a personalist regime. The presidential regime also kind of, fed into that personalization even further. And perhaps one of the reasons why the AKP is getting increasingly weaker is the presidential system. I would not be surprised. This is maybe kind of, too much far-fetched, but he may want to go back to some kind of revision of the system to lower the electoral bar, which he regrets for sure. I'm 100% sure.
He said it. I'm so sorry. He said it. He said they might consider. Yeah, he said
Actually,
it. Sorry.
In 2017, when we were talking about the presidential system, I was like, no, the first person to regret this will be Erdogan himself. It was very sure. Because when you study dominant parties and parliamentary regimes, there are no term limits. you can practically pull off a win and majority in the parliament with 35%, 40% of the votes. It was very, very irrational for him to switch to a presidential system. Perhaps he was kind of, power drunk and he wanted more and more and whatever. But he made a big mistake there. So I would actually expect, if he is kind of, in good health, that's an important if. That's also a possibility that we may want to kind of, keep in mind. If he stays active in political, system, then I expect him to revise the rules of the game, to lower the electoral bar, keep the election intact, so he is still in charge of the competition, but he also is the front runner. As long as he's healthy and he's running, I don't see any kind of, viable candidate or opposition that can defeat him in the shorter run.
You mentioned his state of health, because that was also a discussion during the electoral campaign. He got sick for a while and disappeared from the surface and did not appear in public appearances and canceled some of his meetings. So that also gave some room for speculation about his health, status of health. Can I ask you, Berk, what can we learn from the Turkish example for other competitive authoritarian regimes? It seems, because I was in February in Serbia, which is another case where you see a competitive authoritarian regime which has been consolidated, and opposition there was really looking to Turkey and very interested in developments there, and they were also hoping for a change that would have been also inspiring for others around the globe. What are lessons to be learned from the Turkish example, and what does is it impossible in the end of the day to win over an authoritarian populist regime or government that has captured the state?
Oh no, not at all. And actually, Sebnem and I are currently working on a piece on the presidential elections, and we just recently discussed what the lessons might be from the Turkish election. So let me cite that and actually use our joint talking points. I mean, the one thing that I, that we have sort of seen in this campaign is the difficulty of managing intra-alliance competition and disagreements. And I'm particularly referring to, of course, the CHP versus E party competition. And here, not necessarily an ideological fight, but competition, right? So who's going to get a bigger piece of the pie after winning the election? And of course, I think it really shaped many in intra-alliance dynamics, including, of course, the candidate nomination process. And that, I think, is the other point, because I don't think that anyone would really oppose me when I say that in a competitive authoritarian context, it really makes a lot of sense to establish an opposition alliance. The problem is, opposition alliances generally produce win-win situations in parliamentary elections until, and even sometimes in presidential elections, until you sit down to pick the candidates. And particularly, the parliamentary races, you can, because you have so many seats, you can come to some kind of a compromise. But the choice of the president is basically one person. And so it can really turn into like a zero-sum game. And, looking at different cases, say from Malaysia to Hungary to Turkey, each one of these opposition alliances really came up with a different choice to settle that problem, right? Malaysia in 2018, they went with Mahathir, who is like a 93-year-old politician, but a former prime minister, former incumbent, who ended up, by the way, reneging, who ended up refuting the deal that he originally made, even though they won the election. In Hungary, they went with an unknown candidate because people thought that he'll be able to appeal to the median voter in Hungary, but also one who was not one of the hated figures in the opposition camp. Same thing goes for Turkey, right? So Turkey settled on this weird compromise behind Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, which was not really the choice of the opposition voters. It was not really the choice of the E party. if a nomination process were to be held within CHP, I don't know if it would have been the CHP voters' choice either. So, managing intra-alliance competition and ideological differences or disagreements within the opposition alliance, the candidacy process, the nomination process, it's really a difficult choice. Investing in the political party, the capacity of the opposition parties, and this is a bit of a speculative point. And I think this goes back to our forthcoming piece with Sebnem. In order to win, you need an element of surprise, like you had in the Istanbul race in 2019, right? Because it's a compared authoritarian regime. So if the incumbent thinks that it's going to lose, it can actually really turn the election into a very uneven competition and may even engage in some level of election interference. I don't think that they did it massively. I agree with Sebnem, but of course, a surprise victory is really the key. So Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu's radical messages of, on the one hand, challenging AKP, the Gang of Five, bringing in 300 billion euros of investment from abroad, really unsubstantiated but big talking points, which energize the government voters as well. Maybe rather than doing that, like the 2019 local elections in Istanbul, you stick to basics. You promise good governance. You promise to manage the economy better. No massive big projects, stability, positive politics, I think would have worked out even more. And just one very small point, going back to this discussion in the previous round with regards to the presidential system, I'm undecided. I mean, I agree with Sebnem's point that I'm not too pessimistic. I think Erdogan would want to keep the competitive nature of the compared authoritarian regime in Turkey with one caveat, and that is probably the political ban on İmamoğlu. Or let me not say probably, but it may actually be certified. And so İmamoğlu may be out of politics, at least in the near future, for a bit, not completely, but at least for a bit. But with regards to the presidential system, I don't know if Erdogan would change it, because at the end of the day, despite all these massive problems, earthquake, economic crisis, pandemic, this was one of the most stable periods of an administration in Turkish post-1950 history. Basically, the parliament ended its 5-year term. We didn't have early elections. If, for instance, we had a parliamentary system, the opposition could have easily pushed for a vote of no confidence, would have really turned things tricky between AKP and MHP. But because this was a presidential system where the parliament was completely isolated from the presidency, the president could keep going. So I don't know if Erdogan is unhappy with the presidential system per se. Maybe he may lower the 50% mark and bring it down to 40. But at the end of the day, Turkish politics is so polarized that I think we will probably end up with a 2-candidate race next time around too. So even if it's not 50 but 45%, right, Erdogan would have won. So I don't know what kind of changes will happen, but probably the opposition camp will change. We are finally approaching the end of this old generation of politicians. Devlet Bahçeli, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, Tayyip Erdoğan, they're all in their 70s, and we're really waiting for this new generation to appear.
Thank you, Berk. Senem, I'd like to ask you a question that is about the future of Turkey's foreign relations. Do you say, I mean, it's so difficult to tell, I know, because we're in a very volatile international environment. Things change very fast. But where do you see Turkey in 5 years from now? And also, if you could refer to EU-Turkey relations, what kind of impact do these elections have on EU-Turkey relations? My very personal observation in discussions here is that this the possibility that Erdogan could be voted out through democratic ways somehow changed the perception of Turkey and made people aware that it's much more diverse. There is a resilient civil society. There are political parties, because some people even consider Turkey or compared it with outright dictatorial regimes and weren't aware that Turkey has a strong civil society and so on. So this already, in my view, changed some perceptions about Turkey. But what does it mean for foreign relations and specifically for relations with the EU?
Thank you, Cengiz. Well, I mean, I think in terms of foreign policy, we might expect more of the same. By more of the same, I mean increased disruptive relations with the EU and the Western alliance. I think the contentions with the EU would, the contentious relationship with the EU would most probably continue. I don't expect any progress on issues like visas, customs union, etc., any of that, where certain bilateral progress might have been made in case, and if there is of course, there still is the possibility of an opposition win, but I do agree with Berk and Sebnem that it's not highly likely. So I'm just assuming that, just saying that if Erdogan wins. So I wouldn't have to have any expectations on that front, and perhaps a bit pessimistic, but I also think that if he goes through further autocratic steps, like, imprisoning İmamoğlu, for instance, and I do agree with Berk, I think he would want to get rid of any potentially strong candidates that could challenge him. Demirtas was one of them, and he's still in prison, of course, up to 5 years, I think it's been already. And I fear that İmamoğlu might be next. Of course, this is not going to be forever, and I see both Demirtas and İmamoğlu as representing the future of different poles of the Turkish political scene, but that is in the future, right? Not in the short term, or perhaps in the medium term. So if it goes in that direction, I think the EU could even take steps such as completely abandoning the prospect of Turkish accession, stopping. I mean, the accession negotiation process has also been frozen, or already been frozen de facto, but I think legally as well, they might just want to stop the whole process. So, I mean, perhaps they could take certain measures to that effect. I don't know. And I know that Berk and Sebnem has also given a sort of shown a bit of a light at the end of the tunnel. I don't want to be the most pessimistic one here, but I'm just fearing that these things might happen. So I'm not expecting any progress with relations in the EU. Some in the EU, I think, would be comforted to know that migration deal would continue in the case of an Erdogan win, because I suspected in some of my trips to Brussels and in some of my other meetings that there was a fear that migration deal would actually be challenged should the opposition win. And in my opinion, it was a disgrace on the part of Europe, that claims to be such a upholder of normative values. It still does, despite everything else that it's doing. And I think that was very upsetting for the democratic forces in Turkey as well, to see that Europe could prioritize that at the expense of a domestically driven struggle for democracy and human rights and what have you. So I really have to say that. And
sorry. Yeah.
And in terms of relations with Russia, I would expect
that would be my next question. Yeah.
I would expect the Russian influence to increase on Turkey, definitely, because Erdogan needs to turn to different actors for financial support and also for the survival of the regime. This is not going to be the West, and he needs to change the game of the economy also for money from the West, and also make some concessions on democracy front. And obviously he won't be able to do that with the Nationalist Alliance. That would tie his hands all together. So he would have to turn to other actors, and who these actors would be, partly Russia, partly Kuwait, Malaysia, I don't know. But obviously non-democratic forces that are also happen to have very conflictual relations with the Western and transatlantic community. So in that sense, this also doesn't bode well for European security, which is concerned about Russia, and definitely in the context of Ukraine war. Other minor, not minor issue, but other sort of more specific issues like the Swedish accession to NATO. I think Turkey will at some point approve it, but we don't know when, and I don't expect it to happen tomorrow. So this is something that will also take a while. So more disruptive relationship with the Western partners, I think, more distrust that would build to what's already there, and definitely closer relationship with Russia and other authoritarian players in the wider neighborhood that might provide more of an assistance financially and otherwise for the sustenance of the regime, especially in dire economic straits. That's my expectation.
Bleak picture again.
I'm sorry, I just
no, that's fine.
Wrong person, Cengiz. I'm always a pessimist.
No, thank you for highlighting these issues. We have a couple of questions raised, and Andre would like to speak as well. I'll immediately go to him, but before, let me just ask another question, because the United States, I think today or yesterday, Joe Biden issued a statement like, whoever wins, wins in Turkey, which seems to be a sign of rather disinterest. At least it reads like that. What would you say, Berk? Are the United States less interested in Turkey, which would be surprising in these days of like war in Ukraine and the ambition to build up a front against Russia? So is that just a statement kind of to appease Erdogan, or is there more behind that?
I don't think that the U.S. political establishment is uninterested or disinterested in the Turkish elections. I thought that was just the off the cuff remark by Joe Biden because he wasn't briefed, and I think he was about to do some cycling, and he was just caught off guard. And but Biden is speaking of old age, not in his prime, so I wouldn't read too much into it, but. The Western position, both with regards to European Union and US, is of course quite interesting vis-a-vis Turkey, because on the one hand, it's clear that I think they are displeased by Erdogan. His authoritarian populist approach, the impending economic crisis, the angry diatribes coming from him. But at the same time, they realize that Turkey does hold some cards, the Russo-Ukrainian war, the migration situation, and so on. And so there's a bit of an uneasy feeling because the opposition, they don't know the opposition. We had the first biographical profile articles of Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu over the past 2 months. The guy has been the main opposition leader for the last 13 years, and the Western audience had no idea about him because no one really thought that he would win until this moment. And it turns out that he did, he'll probably not win this time around either. But that, there's not much of an excitement for the opposition as well. So it's not disinterest, it's basically, you don't know what to do with Turkey, kind of, but you also, you can't really throw it away. You can't really distance it because it's too important. But at the same time, there is no longer really an effective ally, that it would act as a maverick actor, both under Erdogan presidency or even under the opposition presidency, which is why they were probably rooting for the opposition, but not very enthusiastically. What would be interesting, and Senem knows about, of course, international relations and Turkish foreign policy far better than I do. My sense is that Erdogan is going to follow the same sort of policy that he has done over the last few years. He's going to sit on the fence. He would act like a non-aligned power, maybe approach Russia a bit more without completely alienating the West. And now that the elections are over, he knows that the West has to deal with him. He has some kind of electoral mandate. So I think Turkey will be an uneasy partner with one caveat, and that is the impending economic crisis. And I think Senem already alluded to this. What we don't know, and the reason why I don't think that Erdogan's regime will get stronger in the next couple of years, materially speaking, like the economy is doing so bad that I don't know if Erdogan has the financial means to entrench his authoritarian regime. That at the end of the day, he still needs Western investments. He still needs some money from abroad. And he will probably need to resort to some kind of return to orthodox policies. Not completely, not Washington consensus per se, but, some return to normalcy, some negotiation with the West. And then, it's unpredictable in the sense that he'll continue to sit on the fence.
Thank you, Berk. Andre de Munter, who is very well known to all of us. Andre, I've opened up the floor. Would you like to make your comment or ask your question? Yes, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Cengiz, and so nice to see all of you. And thank you so much for all your insights. I speak to you as a citizen of Belgium, Belgicalı, but I also feel very much like Türkiye'li in this period. I also couldn't sleep in election night, but things did not really become clearer as the hours passed. And on what Berk said about Kılıçdaroğlu, I mean, spare me the trouble to tell you how many times already I have been asked on how you pronounce the name of that, quote, new guy, unquote. So you're so right. He's been around for 13 years and now he's kind of being unearthed. It's the one with a long name, even more difficult than Erdogan. But anyway, I mean, maybe a short comment on the loyalty issue. I think this plays a very important role also in the diaspora vote. I mean, my country, Belgium, had the highest score in the first round for Erdogan with 72%. And it's true, when you ask people, they say, well, I mean, when we travel back each year to Turkey, we see the difference, and they stick with that. They go back like more than a decade, and they are stuck with the realizations of that first period, which cannot possibly be compared to the last decade, of course. I mean, I don't want to monopolize things. I had a question on the offer, let's put it like that, that was put on the table yesterday, the 12 conditions put on the table by Sinan Oğan, and I would like to hear the panelists' views on that. Some of them, when I read them, are rather like amusing, and you could easily tick the box and say, yeah, for sure, we will do that if you are pleased with that. The other ones, I mean, do you consider it like bluff, like we want 2 ministries, we want to have, I think the word was etkin, and I mean, like influential vice presidency post, and even, I mean, do you think it would be acceptable, like to Kılıçdaroğlu? And of course, we don't know whether this will guarantee in the end that the 5% would just go to the candidate who would accept the offer. That would basically be my
thank you, Andre.
My question.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We have 2 more questions. We kind of transitioned without a break to the Q&A part. Elif has, let's take a couple of questions and then make a final round. Elif.
Actually, I wrote my questions. We don't have time, maybe 10 minutes, right? I don't want to bother you, just about...
We have very short time, that's true. I can't find your question in the chat though anymore. I don't know why it disappeared. Maybe you can pose one of the...
I can read it. Cengiz, I can read it. I see the question. If
here
you don't
it is,
mind.
yes.
Yeah.
I found it now. Do you think maybe one of these we can choose? Do you think there are roles, positions, Russia? Well, I think we addressed this one. Turkish İşçi Partisi, the Turkish Labour Party, had their own list in the election, and that's why they got a lot of criticism, especially from the HDP. What do you think about this strategy? So maybe this is the 3rd electoral alliance, the Freedom and Labour Alliance, that wasn't mentioned so far. Maybe 2 or 3 words on that. And then I have also another question by Till, who is asking about the future of Turkey's NATO membership and relations within NATO, what kind of role Turkey could play within NATO. I suggest each of you take one of these questions. Who would like to go first? Yeah, Sebnem, please.
I want to answer to Andre's question about Oğan. Maybe a couple things that we may want to keep in mind. Most of the things that he raised are actually non-issues, because when you look at Kılıçdaroğlu and the table of 6, their alliance did not have any explicit policies towards any kind of redesign of the country and then territorial integrity and so on and so forth. So they're non-issues from the opposition side. But asking for a position in the cabinet, like, you know, Minister of Interior, like, you know, Vice Presidency and whatever, I think he is overplaying his hand for a number of reasons. I'm not sure he has that much leverage, and I'm not sure if he has control over that 5% of the votes that he got. I've seen some people commenting on this over Twitter. I'm sorry, I don't remember their name. It's not Oğan who actually found these people and represent them. It's actually those people who disillusioned that both of the candidates found Oğan. So it's like, you know, I really don't think he has a lot of leverage there. He is trying to turn this into an opportunity for himself, but I really don't see a lot of leverage that he can pull. I'm not sure if Kılıçdaroğlu will be willing to see that bluff. Perhaps he is. He seems a bit shocked, and he's not. He kind of comes back to his, more rational sense. Maybe he will see that this is not really a deal that he can strike with Oğan, because
Sebnem, I agree. I think he's taken away by his success. And he also said something like, wherever I point, my electorate will vote for that, which is...
That's impossible. Yeah,
that's absolutely impossible.
That's
Berk, do you want to address the question about Turkish Labour Party and the Freedom and Labour Alliance and its role, and what did they do wrong, apparently, as they did not achieve what they aimed to achieve?
I'm actually undecided about this question because I don't have the intra-alliance details. I'm not privy to those discussions that happened. Clearly, I think that there was a collapse of intra-alliance negotiations, but I don't know who we can which side we can attribute this to. Ultimately, I think the same thing happened within the nation alliance as well. When you have a polarized country and the system is becoming more authoritarian, of course, there is an urgency to get majoritarian results, like you need to prevail, and ideological differences are not so important. This is an anti-incumbent election. That's all fine. The problem is all these rational politicians, they hide behind that discourse in order to really impose their own agenda. Kılıçdaroğlu ran around campaigning with the statement that, look, this is the final election, we need to win, this is so important. But during the candidate nomination process, no one really said that if this is the final election that Turkish society is going to experience, let's pick the most popular candidate or the most energetic candidate. The same thing goes for Turkish Workers' Party and HDP, the pro-Kurdish HDP or the Green Left Party. Yes, I think it was important that they should have pooled in their votes. But of course, what I've been hearing is that HDP gave only 2 MP quotas to Turkish Workers' Party, which is excessively low. But that, in turn, the Turkish Workers' Party asked for 20, which is excessively high. Now, I don't know if these numbers are verified. Like I said, I'm not privy to these intra-alliance discussions. But at the end of the day, you need to give minor parties some room. So that they can benefit, but the minor parties cannot really act in a maximalist manner. And it seems that negotiation collapsed, and the Turkish Workers' Party had to go along, but under an alliance structure. Now, I think they were a bit over-enthusiastic because of the support that they generated on social media, especially in the aftermath of the earthquake, and they overestimated their appeal. And I think they wanted really an alternative. I mean, there's a clear ideological difference that became very palpable during the intra-party discussions that was conducted on the media. The pro-Kurdish party, at the end of the day, is a pro-Kurdish party. And the Turkish Workers' Party, of course, cares for the Kurdish question, but wants to have a fully fledged socialist agenda. But at the same time, they have no access to the working class in Turkey. So they're also a party supported by upper middle class university students. And it created a set of dilemmas that they couldn't overcome. I'm not necessarily accusing one side fully, but it's clearly a collapse of bargaining. But they actually performed better than I thought they would. And this is probably because of the terrible joint list that CHP prepared in major cities.
Thank you, Berk. And at least it highlights that there is some potential for left-wing policy in Turkey. I think, Senem, we're almost running out of time, but quickly the question on NATO. And then I would like to, if it's a very short question, Alexander Karapiperis, if you prepare a question. But first, let's go to Senem and then.
Yeah. On NATO, well, I think we have to acknowledge the fact that Turkey for a while now has been a bit of a marginalized player in NATO. So what you see is the other countries getting together, often unofficially, so that Turkey isn't necessarily involved. And so it tries to pursue this so-called balancing relationship, or that's why it says it will do, between Russia and Ukraine and the West. But I don't think it's a genuinely balanced and transparent relationship or a hedging strategy, especially given Turkey's insistence on vetoing Finland and Sweden. Now they approved Finland, but we don't know what's going to happen with Sweden. And also given the actual arrangements or promises or concessions made to Russia behind closed doors, which we don't know anything about because there is no transparency in foreign policy making process, and plus extra centralization, as we see in other policy areas as well. So I don't see Turkey regaining the trust of its Western allies within NATO in the context, if we assume that the government will continue this foreign policy line. So that's my line of thinking here. And perhaps something to add on the OAN voters. Now, perhaps I'm speculating here, but my hunch is that, so in response to Andre's question, hi, Andre, by the way, wonderful to hear you.
Hi.
Is that I have a feeling that they're not going to endorse neither of the two candidates, because I think that the list they put out there was a kind of signaling to their voters their position. So it wasn't, only sort of put out there to get concessions, but also to signal that that was their position. I think they will probably try the longer game, where they'll try to establish themselves as a secular ultra-nationalist party, which will still have wide support, assuming that we're still going to have the migration problem coupled with a larger economic crisis, in my opinion. And I don't think the governing party is sort of endorsing them as well. They probably feel like they don't necessarily need their support. And even if they don't give anything to them, that some of their supporters will still vote them for Erdogan to the extent that it will help him to win. So I don't think they're going to get any concessions from MH, and also MHP has a very sort of hard, strong anti-rhetoric against Zafer Partisi and all on. So I don't think they have anything to gain from there. And I don't think they want to align with the opposition as well. Also, perhaps fearing that they won't be able to carry their voters, and they will also lose from that process. They would perhaps harm their longer term strategy. So that's my thinking. Of course, this is Turkey. Anything can change in 1 or 2 days. So
that's true.
I might be absolutely wrong.
There is one constant. The country is difficult and can change within a minute. That's true. Alexander, please, a short question,
yes,
and then
quick.
Yes.
Quick. Thank you, Cengiz. Good afternoon from Athens, Greece. I would like to direct my question to Senem Hoca, and concerns the future relations between Turkey and the West. Assuming that Turkey is not China's Sea or Putin's Russia, much more is related, let's say, to Venezuela's Maduro Venezuela. Do you think that the financial predicament of Turkey can used by the West as a leverage in order to direct Turkey to a more predictable future foreign policy and improve her relations with the West?
Thank you, Alexander. Senem.
Will I get that? Well, Alexander, thank you for the question. Of course, the West has huge financial leverage, but do they want to use it I think is a more apt question here. Why risk their economic interests? Why risk the interests of German business in Turkey, for instance, for the sake of Turkish democracy, or bearing the further risk of Turkey falling more and more in the hands of Russia in the given context? So yes, of course, Turkey is not like Venezuela in the sense that it doesn't have oil, right? So it would need to have external money. And so I agree with Berk there. But then we also have to consider the West or Western countries also bearing their own economic interests in their dealings with Turkey. So this is not just an issue about promoting democracy. I think primarily it's first about securing their own interests. So of course, overall, the United States, Europe, they do have the leverage, but whether they would use it or what the repercussions of that would be, because then having Turkey as a more close society, already anti-Western, turning really introvert, going on the Russian road, becoming an almost a satellite, that also doesn't work for Europe interests, not economically, but also longer-term security wise as well. So I don't see it.
Cengiz, we can't hear you.
I'm sorry. I was muted. I was saying we lost Senem, I think. She has bad connection. And we are at the end of this event anyways. So I'm really sorry. I would have loved to say goodbye. Here she is. Hi, Senem. Sorry we lost you.
I'm so sorry. I think my battery has just run out on my computer. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm back. Yeah. Anyway, so but I had already concluded my answer. So
thank you so much. And we run out of time. It was really a pleasure talking to you in this time of, for me at least, depression after the first electoral round. It's great to hear from experts, so many different views and opinions. And I would just end with a note: don't give up on Turkey and Turkish democracy. I think there is still hope, and it's a country that has highlighted, these elections have at least highlighted that it's not easy to put this country into one category, and that there are so many different dynamics, unexpected ones also, that might shape developments we can't foresee right now. So we will see what's going to happen in the second round. Thank you so much. Thank you also the audience. And this was something new. We've never done something at this time of the day. It's rather early, but we've recorded and we will put it online. And I can also, I would kindly ask you to share it as well. It was a great discussion. Looking forward to seeing you at another occasion. Thank you so much. All the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
bye, everyone.
Bye.
Cengiz.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.